The lives of women in Berlin during the air raids stand as one of the most profound and overlooked stories of endurance, struggle, and unyielding resilience in the face of unimaginable devastation. As the war tightened its suffocating grip on the German capital, the ordinary rhythms of daily existence were replaced by a tense cycle of alarms, uncertainty, and fear, and women found themselves at the center of a crumbling world that demanded far more from them than society had ever expected. Berlin, once a thriving hub of culture, industry, and urban life, transformed into a battleground of firestorms and collapsing buildings as Allied bombers methodically stripped away its infrastructure, neighborhoods, and sense of normalcy. In this suffocating environment, women became the backbone of civilian survival, balancing the immense emotional weight of protecting their families with the relentless practical tasks required to keep life moving in a city under siege. Their days were shaped by ration queues that stretched across blocks, careful calculations of how to stretch dwindling supplies, and constant vigilance toward the sky, where dark formations of aircraft could appear without warning. Nights were even more harrowing, marked by the sharp wails of sirens that tore families from their sleep and sent them racing down stairwells into overcrowded shelters, where the air was thick with panic, sweat, and whispered prayers. Mothers clutched infants, elderly women trembled beneath blankets, and girls barely old enough to grasp the enormity of the war looked to their mothers' faces for reassurance, even as those same mothers silently battled their own terror. Every explosion above ground sent dust drifting from the ceiling, every tremor signaled another building lost, and every lull in the bombing raised the haunting question of what would be left when they emerged. Yet even amid this relentless cycle, women carried forward the responsibilities that society, circumstance, and necessity had placed on their shoulders. With men drafted to distant fronts, women ran households alone, repaired damage after each raid, managed finances, worked in factories, staffed essential public services, and brought structure to chaos through sheer force of will. Their roles expanded rapidly as Berlin's systems faltered. They became tram operators navigating shattered tracks, nurses tending to burned and traumatized victims, administrative workers maintaining the skeleton of government functions, and laborers in munitions plants producing materials for a war that showed no signs of slowing. The emotional toll was equally immense. Letters from husbands and sons became less frequent, and each silent week deepened the dread that hovered in women's minds. News of casualties arrived unpredictably, and the arrival of uniformed messengers near any building caused hearts to freeze with the fear that loss was about to strike. Women mourned quietly because war rarely granted them time to grieve. Responsibilities resumed long before the tears dried. Amid this personal suffering, they also confronted the devastation of their communities. Entire neighborhoods were erased overnight, familiar streets turned into blackened ruins, and cherished possessions lost in minutes to fire and falling debris. The landscape of the city changed so rapidly that returning to one's home district after a night of bombing felt like stepping into a different world, one marked by smoke, collapsed buildings, and the haunting silence of lives abruptly ended. Still, despite fear, exhaustion, and profound grief, women continued forward, driven by a mixture of duty, instinct, and the unwillingness to surrender to despair. Their contributions extended far beyond physical labor. They created communal support networks that sustained emotional well-being, shared scarce resources with neighbors who had lost everything, comforted children waking from nightmares, and rebuilt social cohesion at a time when society seemed to be falling apart. Small acts such as preparing a makeshift holiday meal, mending a stranger's coat, or telling stories to frightened children during an air raid became crucial threads holding communities together. They also became symbols of Berlin's determination to survive, the Trümmerfrauen, or Rubble Women, who climbed over mountains of debris with buckets and tools, clearing roads, salvaging bricks, and initiating the physical recovery of the city long before political reconstruction even began. Their labor was grueling, dangerous, and endless, yet it demonstrated an unbreakable spirit that endured even as Berlin crumbled around them. Beyond labor and survival, women bore deep psychological scars that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The constant stress, lack of sleep, and repeated exposure to destruction created lasting trauma, expressed in bursts of panic at loud sounds, recurring nightmares, or emotional numbness that shielded them from further pain. Yet these internal battles remained largely invisible to the world, because women were expected to stay strong, to comfort others, and to move forward even when their own strength was thinning. They carried guilt over lives they could not save, over children they could not fully protect, over homes they watched burn while helpless in shelters, and over moments when fear overwhelmed them. But despite these inner struggles, they persisted with extraordinary courage. As the war dragged on, Berlin's women embodied a quiet heroism that has often been overshadowed by the dramatic narratives of battles and political events. Their story is not one of soldiers or strategy, but of survival in its purest form, of keeping families alive when everything familiar collapsed, of maintaining dignity amid rubble, of holding on to hope when the future was uncertain, and of rebuilding a city with their bare hands once the bombing ceased. When the final air raid ended and Berlin emerged into a fragile post-war reality, women once again led the city's recovery. They cleared rubble, reorganized neighborhoods, revived social institutions, and helped transform a shattered capital into a functioning society. Their endurance during the air raids and their perseverance in the aftermath laid the emotional and structural foundation for the Berlin that would eventually rise from ashes. The story of women in Berlin during the air raids is therefore more than a wartime narrative. It is a testament to human resilience, a portrait of courage forged in darkness, and a reminder that the quiet strength of ordinary people often shapes history as profoundly as any grand event. Their lives, shaped by fear, yet defined by fortitude, revealed the extraordinary capacities of women who bore the brunt of the city's suffering and ultimately became the pillars of its survival. In the early years of the 1940s, Berlin stood as the powerful and imposing heart of the Third Reich, a city buzzing with propaganda, pride, and a sense of invincibility. But beneath the surface of grand parades, military speeches, and the rigid order of Nazi society, a quiet unease began to grow. Women across Berlin, housewives, factory workers, nurses, teachers, and young girls, felt a tension in the air that no official announcement could ease. They were the first to notice the shift in daily life, the sudden shortages in shops, the disappearance of men from neighborhoods as they went off to fight, and the strange tightening of security measures across the city. The rising shadow over Berlin was not cast in a single moment. It crept in slowly, unsettlingly, through whispers, rumors, and the distant thunder of war that was beginning to draw closer each day. For Berlin's women, the war had already begun long before the first bombs pierced the sky. The propaganda machine constantly reminded them of their duty to the nation, idealizing them as mothers, caretakers, and the silent strength behind the German soldier. Yet behind the posters and speeches was a growing fear of what would happen when the war that had remained comfortably far away finally reached their homes. Newspapers were tightly controlled, masking defeats as strategic retreats, exaggerating victories, and pretending that the Reich's enemies were too weak to truly threaten the capital. But women heard stories from relatives in other cities. They read between the lines. They saw the faces of refugees quietly entering Berlin from the bombed-out regions of the Ruhr and Hamburg. Even without the truth being spoken aloud, the truth revealed itself. As 1942 turned into 1943, the atmosphere in Berlin transformed dramatically. Air raid drills became a constant part of life. Women were instructed on how to use gas masks, how to extinguish small fires, and how to shield their children during an attack. The once vibrant nightlife of Berlin dimmed into something quieter, more cautious. Theaters shortened their performances, restaurants closed earlier. Street lamps were dimmed or completely switched off, plunging entire neighborhoods into eerie darkness. What was once a city filled with confidence now felt like a place holding its breath. Mothers walked their children to school with an uneasy glance at the sky, as though expecting danger to materialize out of the clouds at any moment. Women waiting in ration lines spoke softly among themselves, never loud enough for authorities to overhear, about rumors of massive bombing campaigns in other European cities. The sense of waiting, of anticipating an inevitable blow, settled like a cold fog over Berlin. Even women who once believed wholeheartedly in the promises of the Reich felt their loyalty shake as the city prepared for the unthinkable. The government insisted that Berlin was fortified, protected by the most advanced aircraft systems, guarded by an unbreakable shield of German engineering and military might. But women noticed details that told a different story. They saw the hurried construction of new bunkers, the deepening of trenches, and the increased patrols in the skies above the capital. They witnessed the growing exhaustion of soldiers stationed within the city, men who looked older with each passing day, their faces marked by sleepless nights and unspoken dread. Berlin was preparing for something, even if the propaganda refused to name it. In apartment blocks and crowded courtyards, women tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for their families. They continued to shop, cook, clean, work, and care for the elderly. But their thoughts were often elsewhere, on the potential dangers that might descend without warning. Many women began storing essentials: blankets, medicines, water, and whatever food they could spare. Their instincts guided them more than official orders ever did. Some had survived World War I as children and recognized the signs of a city on the brink of crisis. Others had never experienced war firsthand, but felt a deepening pulse of fear with each siren drill and each low hum of aircraft engines overhead. Berlin's women were not merely bystanders at the edge of history. They were witnesses to the gradual unraveling of the world they knew. They watched as the sky above the capital grew heavier, darker, filled with more than just clouds. The rising shadow over Berlin was a psychological transformation as much as a physical threat. It was the slow dismantling of certainty, the erosion of safety, and the quiet onset of a new reality in which every night might bring destruction. Yet within this growing darkness, women found ways to strengthen one another. Neighbors who once exchanged only polite greetings now shared food, stories, and comfort. Mothers supported each other as they struggled to keep their children calm. Factory women formed tight-knit groups, helping each other endure long shifts and longer nights. In the face of looming danger, Berlin's women created small circles of resilience that allowed them to endure what was coming. As the first enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon and the initial blasts shook the city, Berlin's women were not surprised. They had felt this moment approaching as surely as one feels the pressure of an approaching storm. The shadow had finally arrived, not as a whisper, but as a roar that shattered the air and split the night sky open. And from that moment on, their lives would never again resemble the world they once knew. The first time the sirens wailed across Berlin, many women froze in place, unsure whether the noise was real or some sort of test. The sound, shrill, rising, mechanical, almost inhuman, cut through the city like a blade. Windows trembled, children cried, and for a single suspended moment, the entire capital seemed to pause. But that hesitation was brief. Women had been trained, warned, instructed through pamphlets and radio broadcasts about what to do when the alarm sounded. And yet nothing in those instructions could fully prepare them for the visceral fear that struck when the city's air raid sirens screamed to life for the first time. As the alarms howled into the night, women moved instinctively. Mothers grabbed their children from beds still warm with sleep. Grandmothers hurried to collect identity papers, ration cards, and precious family photos. The younger women, many working long shifts in factories or hospitals, shifted immediately into action, guiding coworkers or patients toward designated shelters. The city, moments ago quiet beneath a blanket of darkness, erupted into sudden, frantic motion. Berlin streets filled with hurried footsteps. Women, wrapped in coats hastily thrown on over nightgowns, guided their families into the blacked-out night. Neighbors who barely greeted each other by day now clung together as they descended stairwells, crossed courtyards, or rushed toward the nearest bunker entrance. The darkness of the city, imposed to hide it from enemy aircraft, turned even familiar streets into dangerous labyrinths. Women groped along walls, stumbling over uneven pavements, calling softly to children who struggled to keep up. The sirens continued in long, rising waves, warning not just of danger but of its increasing closeness. For many women, the rush to shelters became an instinctual routine. Extinguish lights, gather the essentials, check on elderly relatives or neighbors, move quickly but carefully, and above all, keep the children calm. But during those first nights, everything felt uncertain. How much time did they have? Minutes? Seconds? No one truly knew. Inside the shelters, the air was thick with fear, sweat, and whispers. Women pressed together with strangers, each trying to carve out a small pocket of space for their family. Children buried their faces in their mothers' laps, trembling at the distant rumble of engines overhead. Some women clutched prayer books, others stared ahead, their faces pale, listening for the explosive confirmation that Berlin was under attack. The tension inside the shelters was almost unbearable, an unseen weight that settled over every breath, every whispered word, every heartbeat. As anti-aircraft guns fired into the sky, the ground trembled lightly, as if the earth itself was shivering. Women felt the vibrations under their feet, a physical reminder of the war reaching into the heart of the city. The thundering booms echoed in their chests, mingling with the steady rhythm of their own fear. They wondered whether their homes would still be standing when they emerged, whether friends or loved ones elsewhere in the city were safe, whether this night would be the one that changed everything. Even as the routine of rushing to shelters became more familiar, the emotional toll grew heavier. Nights were no longer restful. Sleep became fragmented, fragile, constantly interrupted by alarms that could come at any hour. Women learned to doze lightly, listening unconsciously for the faint beginning of the siren's wail. Every sound, distant thunder, a passing vehicle, the creak of a building could be mistaken for the start of another alarm. Rest became a luxury none could rely on. Women adapted. They placed shoes beside beds for quicker escape. They packed small air raid bags with essentials, bread, documents, spare clothes for children, a bit of medicine. Some kept kettles warm late into the night, knowing they might not return home until dawn. Mothers taught their children how to move quickly, how to stay close, how to put on gas masks without panicking. These routines, once unimaginable, became the rhythm of survival. The streets during alarms were scenes of organized chaos. Women pulled small wagons carrying infants or elderly family members. Nurses escorted patients on stretchers. Factory workers moved in tight groups, their faces illuminated occasionally by the glow of distant fires or flares in the sky. The eerie silence between siren cycles made everything even more surreal, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for impact. Some women experienced the rush to shelters as a moment of strength, a time when their protective instincts surged, giving them the clarity and determination needed to navigate danger. Others struggled under the strain, trembling as they guided their children forward, fighting back tears each time the sky vibrated with the drone of approaching aircraft. But regardless of fear or courage, they moved. They always moved. Survival demanded nothing less. As the frequency of air raids increased, women became experts at reading the tones of the alarms. The rising, falling wail meant incoming aircraft. The continuous tone meant danger had passed, at least for now. But even the all-clear brought little comfort. Emerging from shelters often meant discovering fires burning in the distance, hearing the crackle of collapsing buildings, or seeing ambulances racing through the ruined streets. Yet even in these harrowing moments, women held their families together. They comforted children who shook with fear. They reassured elderly parents who remembered the terror of the last war. They helped neighbors who stumbled, disoriented from the shelters. The rush to safety was not merely physical, it was emotional, communal, built on shared strength and unspoken bonds. Night after night, the alarms returned. Night after night, Berlin's women repeated the same exhausting ritual. Each time the city grew a little more damaged. Each time its people grew a little more worn. But each time the women endured, because they had no choice, because survival required it, because their families depended on them. Life inside the air raid shelters of Berlin was a world entirely separate from the streets above, a world defined by cramped spaces, stale air, and the uneasy silence shared by thousands who had suddenly found themselves dependent on one another for survival. For the women of Berlin, the shelters became an extension of their homes, though devoid of light, comfort, or normality. These underground chambers, some newly built, others repurposed from basements, tunnels, and subway stations, were where they waited out the long nights of bombardment, suspended between fear and duty, exhaustion and resilience. As the heavy steel doors closed behind them, the noise of the outside world shifted into a muffled hum. The distant rumble of aircraft, the thuds of anti-aircraft guns, and the occasional tremor of distant explosions seeped through the thick walls, creating an atmosphere that was both claustrophobic and terrifying. Women arrived breathless, clutching children, pulling blankets or dragging small bags of essentials. They learned quickly which corners provided the most stability, where the benches were least crowded, and how to navigate the narrow aisles in near darkness. The shelters were lit by dim bulbs or lanterns that flickered under the strain of unreliable power. Shadows clung to the walls, stretching across faces that wore the weight of sleepless nights. Women settled onto hard wooden benches or cold concrete floors, their bodies cramped into whichever space they could find. For many, the shelters became a strange community, a gathering of strangers who learned each other's names, stories, fears, and whispered hopes over the course of countless nights. Children were often the most unsettled, their cries echoing through the confined space. Mothers soothed them with whispered reassurances, rocking them gently despite their own trembling hands. Some women created small routines to distract their children, telling stories, singing softly, or allowing them to clutch a favorite toy. But nothing could completely shield them from the thundering vibrations that occasionally rippled through the shelter walls, signaling a nearby detonation. Conversations inside the shelters were muted, built on murmurs and brief exchanges. Women spoke about ration shortages, letters from the front, worries about homes left above ground, and rumors of raids on other cities. They traded advice about keeping children calm, shared bits of food, and supported elderly neighbors whose memories of the previous war were often too vivid for comfort. In these interactions, a silent bond formed, a recognition that survival was a collective effort. As the raids continued, the stale air became increasingly difficult to breathe. Ventilation systems often struggled under the strain of overcrowded bunkers. The smell of sweat, damp wool, and faint smoke clung to the bodies packed closely together. Women fanned themselves with newspapers or scraps of cardboard, trying to ease the oppressive heat that built up in the deeper shelters. Many shelters had rules: no smoking, no loud noise, restricted movement, but enforcing these rules became nearly impossible during moments of panic. Nurses assigned to shelters worked tirelessly to tend to fainting spells, asthma attacks, or anxiety-induced collapses. Women helped however they could, offering water, supporting patients on their laps, or assisting with makeshift bedding. The shelter floors often became temporary wards where the injured or overwhelmed lay waiting for the all-clear. Women who had never considered themselves strong suddenly found themselves acting as caregivers, mediators, and protectors, forced to respond to emergencies in conditions that were both physically and emotionally draining. Above all, time inside the shelters moved differently, sluggishly, anxiously, with each minute stretching into what felt like hours. Women kept their eyes fixed on the entrances, waiting for officials to signal that it was safe to emerge. The silence that occasionally settled over the room was broken only by the hum of fear or the quiet prayers whispered into hands clasped tightly in hope. Some women tried to read, though the dim lighting made it difficult. Others knitted, using the repetitive motions to calm their nerves. Many simply sat still, conserving energy, listening to the distant chaos they could not see but could not forget. The shelters became a space where thoughts spiraled, worries about family members in distant battlefields, fears for homes that might be destroyed while they hid underground, uncertainty about when or whether the war would end. When the bombs struck close, dust sometimes drifted from the ceiling, and women instinctively shielded their children, bracing for the worst. The walls shuddered, and for a moment everyone froze, breath held, eyes wide, until the vibrations faded. Only then could they exhale, though the relief was always temporary. Every raid felt different, unpredictable, capable of destroying everything they loved in a single instant. Despite the terror, moments of unexpected kindness emerged. Women shared stories to distract one another, exchanged recipes, spoke about weddings, births, lost relatives, or memories of peacetime Berlin. These conversations were brief escapes, small attempts to reclaim humanity within the suffocating confines of the shelter. Some shelters housed hundreds, others only a few dozen. In the larger ones, particularly in subway stations, women sometimes walked along the platforms to stretch their legs, careful not to disturb sleeping families sprawled on blankets. They stepped over bags and baskets, mindful of the frail elderly who often slept sitting upright. The sound of trains, halted during raids, gave the shelter an eerie stillness. Throughout these long nights, women became the emotional anchors for their families. Their voices carried reassurance even when their own hearts thudded with dread. They watched over sleeping children, offered comfort to neighbors, and maintained a fragile calm that helped everyone endure the horror outside. They learned to adapt to the rhythms of destruction, alert, descend, wait, emerge, repeating the cycle with a resilience born from necessity. Life inside the air raid shelters was defined by endurance, compassion, and unspoken unity. It revealed the strength of ordinary women forced into extraordinary circumstances. These dark, crowded rooms became places where they confronted fear head-on, waited for dawn, and braced themselves for whatever awaited above ground. And with each night spent underground, they carried within them the quiet hope that someday the sirens would fall silent forever. When the all-clear sirens finally echoed through the shelters, the women of Berlin rose slowly, stiff from hours of waiting and drained by the weight of fear that had pressed on their chests throughout the night. Pushing open the heavy steel doors, they stepped into streets that no longer resembled the neighborhoods they had left behind. Dawn often revealed a landscape transformed by fire and destruction. Buildings cracked open like broken shells, windows shattered into sparkling debris, and familiar roads buried beneath piles of bricks and smashed timber. The city that had once stood proud and orderly now appeared wounded, its facades blackened by smoke, its air thick with the acrid smell of burning. For many women, emerging from the shelters was the most heart-wrenching moment of the entire ordeal. Their steps were slow, cautious, marked by the dread of what they might find. Some covered their mouths with scarves against the dust, while others shielded their children's eyes from scenes too harsh for young minds to comprehend. Fires smoldered from roofs and upper floors. Ash drifted through the air like dark snow. Streets that had once been lined with shops and cafes were now tangled with twisted metal and fallen beams. Each morning after a raid felt like stepping into a new world, one smaller, quieter, and more broken than the one before it. The first task for many women was locating their homes. With landmarks destroyed, the usual paths became disorienting. What had been a bustling square might now be an empty crater. Apartment blocks stood stripped of their facades, exposing kitchens, bedrooms, and sitting rooms like dollhouses left open to the day. Women scanned the ruins for anything familiar: a doorframe, a curtain fluttering from a shattered window, the remnants of a staircase. Some found their building still standing, though wounded. Others found nothing more than a heap of rubble. And in that instant, grief struck with a force sharper than any explosion. Still, even in the face of devastation, women moved with determination. Those whose homes had been spared hurried to check on neighbors, calling out into the debris, searching for survivors. They climbed over unstable piles of stone, pulled aside blocks of masonry with bare hands, and listened desperately for voices beneath the rubble. The effort was chaotic, fueled by instinct and hope rather than any coordinated plan. Yet these moments revealed extraordinary courage, women refusing to abandon their communities, clinging to the belief that someone could still be saved. Fire brigades and rescue teams arrived as soon as the raids ended, but they were overworked, exhausted, and often understaffed. Women joined their efforts without hesitation. They formed bucket lines to extinguish small fires. They dug through collapsed basements. They carried injured neighbors on makeshift stretchers using doors or wooden planks when medical equipment was scarce. Many women had no training, yet necessity transformed them into rescuers. Their hands blistered, their clothes tore, and their throats burned from inhaling smoke, but they continued, driven by the urgency of survival. Not every discovery brought hope. Women sometimes stumbled upon lifeless bodies in the ruins, neighbors, friends, or strangers who had not reached shelter in time. These moments carved deep wounds into the hearts of those who found them. Mothers shielded their children from the sight, turning their faces away and whispering gentle lies. Older women whispered prayers, honoring the dead even when there was no time for proper burial. The losses accumulated day by day, leaving emotional scars that no rebuilding could erase. Amid the devastation, women also confronted practical challenges. Homes that still stood often had no electricity or water. Gas lines had ruptured. Windows were blown out, leaving rooms exposed to cold winds. Women boarded up openings with whatever materials they could scavenge, old doors, sheets of metal, or broken furniture, creating makeshift barriers to keep out the creeping chill. They swept glass from floors, salvaged clothing from overturned drawers, and searched for usable food among the chaos. Survival required a strange blend of mourning and pragmatism, each woven tightly into their daily routines. Children wandered cautiously among the ruins, clutching their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with confusion. Some were too young to grasp the enormity of what had happened. Others understood all too well. Women guided them carefully, teaching them which areas were dangerous, instructing them never to touch unexploded fragments of bombs, and trying to shield them from the worst of the destruction. But shielding had its limits. The city itself became an ever-present reminder of the war's brutal reality. As the days went on, the rhythm of destruction and repair became an inescapable part of life. Women swept streets, cleared pathways, shared tools, and helped neighbors rebuild damaged walls or patch holes in roofs. When entire buildings had collapsed, women worked together to create temporary homes, converting cellars into sleeping spaces, sharing surviving rooms with displaced families, or moving into overcrowded shelters until safer housing could be arranged. Their resilience was quiet but unbreakable, holding the fabric of daily life together even as the city crumbled around them. Amid all this, Berliners learned to read the signs of destruction, where the bombs had fallen hardest, how far the fires had spread, which neighborhoods had been struck more severely. Women exchanged information throughout the morning: who was missing, which streets were blocked, where aid had arrived, which shops still had supplies. These networks became lifelines, offering not just practical help, but emotional support. Women comforted one another, shared tears, and reminded each other of small reasons to keep going. Evenings after a raid carried a strange stillness. Once the smoke began to settle, women would stand outside their damaged homes or sit on broken steps, staring up at a sky that had brought terror only hours ago. The sunset often cast a red glow over the ruins, blending with the lingering haze to paint the city in surreal, haunting colors. It was during these quiet moments that many women allowed themselves to feel the full weight of their exhaustion. They held their children close, spoke softly with neighbors, or simply sat in silence, letting the grief seep slowly into their bones. Yet, despite everything, life persisted. Women cooked simple meals over improvised stoves. They washed salvaged clothing in basins. They tended to wounds, comforted the bereaved, and prepared for the possibility of another night of alarms. Emerging from the shelters into ruins became a cycle, one that tested the limits of their endurance, but never extinguished their determination to survive. Berlin, scarred and battered, looked increasingly like a ghost of the capital it had once been. But in its ashes, the strength of its women burned fiercely. Day after day they stepped into the broken streets with resilience forged from necessity, hope anchored in stubborn survival, and a will strong enough to carry their families through the darkest days of the war. Their footsteps across the shattered sidewalks became a quiet testament to courage, a reminder that even amid ruins, life endures. As the war tightened its grip around Berlin, women increasingly became the silent force sustaining the city's fragile existence. With men drafted into the military and entire districts buckling under repeated air assaults, the everyday functioning of Berlin depended on the labor, endurance, and adaptability of its women. Their roles expanded far beyond traditional domestic responsibilities. They became the workers, the organizers, the caretakers, and the emotional anchors of a population pushed to the brink. On the home front, the absence of men meant women were suddenly responsible for every aspect of family survival. They handled rationing with strategic precision, stretching meager portions of bread, potatoes, and canned goods to feed entire households. Shops and markets often held long lines, sometimes lasting hours, and women stood patiently with ration cards in hand, hoping the shelves would not be empty by the time their turn arrived. Even when supplies dwindled, they found creative methods to prepare meals, using substitutes and improvised ingredients that could barely be called food by pre-war standards. Yet these efforts kept their families nourished through scarcity that grew more severe with each passing month. Beyond the household, women stepped into roles previously dominated by men. Factories, once filled primarily with male workers, now relied heavily on female labor. Women operated heavy machinery, assembled weapons, repaired damaged equipment, and worked long shifts through smoke-filled halls and deafening noise. Their hands became calloused, their backs strained, their lungs filled with dust and fumes, yet they continued. For many, the work was not merely an obligation, it was a duty they felt towards sons, husbands, and brothers fighting far from home. Public services could not function without them. Women drove trams through streets scarred by bomb craters. They staffed hospitals, overflowing with casualties from both the front lines and the nightly air raids. Nurses worked around the clock, tending to burns, crushed limbs, smoke inhalation, and trauma. They performed their duties with quiet determination, ignoring their exhaustion and the ever-present fear that the next raid would bring even more injured through the doors. Their compassion became a lifeline, not only for the wounded, but for the families who waited anxiously in the hallways, hoping their loved ones would survive. There were also the Trümmerfrauen, Rubble Women, who became one of the most enduring symbols of resilience. These women took on the immense task of clearing the debris left by each air raid. Armed with shovels, buckets, and their own physical strength, they climbed over ruined structures, sorted bricks from splintered timber, and piled debris into carts. Their work was grueling and dangerous. They inhaled dust until their throats burned, their hands bled from handling jagged rubble. They risked injury from unstable structures that could collapse without warning. Yet every day they returned, knowing the city could not recover unless its ruins were cleared. Their efforts slowly carved pathways through destruction, clearing streets so emergency workers could reach damaged buildings, reopening areas so survivors could rebuild their lives, and restoring small parts of a city battered into near unrecognizability. Women also maintained the emotional and social fabric of Berlin in a time when hope was difficult to sustain. They organized communal kitchens, sharing what little food they had with neighbors who had lost everything. They checked on elderly residents who could not cope alone, brought them water, prepared their meals, and helped them walk to the shelters when the siren sounded. They tended to children who had become withdrawn or anxious from the constant bombardment, using stories, games, and simple affection to draw them out of fear. Many children had not seen their fathers in years, and for them, their mothers became both parents. Stern when necessary, gentle when possible, unwavering always. The psychological endurance required of women during this time was immense. They had to appear strong for their families, even when their own spirits were strained to breaking. They spent nights awake in shelters, listening to bombs tear through the city above, wondering whether their homes would still be standing when dawn arrived. And yet, as soon as the raids ended, they rose, brushed soot from their hair, and began the day's work. They stood in ration lines, went to their jobs, repaired damaged rooms, and calmed frightened children, as though fear could be folded neatly away like a blanket and stored for later. Women also played an important role in preserving a sense of cultural continuity. Even in the grip of war, they found ways to maintain traditions. They celebrated holidays with improvised decorations. They sewed clothes for their children from repurposed fabric. They patched together small celebrations for birthdays or milestones, giving loved ones brief moments of joy amidst the bleakness. These gestures, however small, strengthened morale and reminded families that life continued despite the destruction around them. Some women engaged in quiet acts of resistance. Though outward dissent was dangerous, many privately rejected the propaganda that tried to justify the suffering. In hushed conversations with trusted friends or neighbors, they questioned the decisions that had brought Berlin to such devastation. They listened to forbidden radio broadcasts, shared clandestine information about the true state of the war, and helped those who were targeted by discriminatory policies. These acts, though hidden, demonstrated moral courage that history would later recognize. Community networks formed naturally as women sought connection and support. Groups of neighbors worked together to repair damaged homes, share resources, safeguard children, and organize shelter routines. These networks became essential, especially for widows, mothers of young children, and the elderly. Women understood that survival depended on cooperation. They traded skills. One knew how to patch clothing, another could mend broken furniture, another had connections to limited medical supplies. Together, they built systems of mutual aid that kept entire blocks functioning despite the chaos. Their resilience was without cost. Many women suffered from chronic exhaustion, malnutrition, and untreated injuries. Stress etched lines into their faces, and grief hollowed their eyes. They carried the weight of uncertainty every moment of the day. Uncertainty over the fate of loved ones fighting far away. uncertainty about whether the next bomb would find them, uncertainty about what future, if any, awaited Berlin. Yet through all this, they continued to move forward. Their determination was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, consistent, and deeply rooted in necessity. They did not have the luxury of breaking down. Their families needed them, their communities relied on them, and their city, reduced though it was to rubble and smoke, survived because of them. Women became the backbone of Berlin not by choice, but by circumstance, though they bore the burden with remarkable strength. Their labor, their sacrifices, and their unwavering resilience held the city together during its darkest hours. Without their contributions, the Berlin that emerged after the war, scarred but standing, could not have existed. The psychological burden carried by the women of Berlin during the air raids was both immense and enduring. Every night brought a renewed sense of dread as the familiar wail of the sirens cut through the air, forcing them to abandon whatever tasks they were doing and rush toward the shelters with their children, elderly relatives, and whatever belongings they could gather in seconds. This repeated cycle of terror fractured their sense of safety and disrupted even the most basic routines, creating an atmosphere where fear lived side by side with daily responsibilities. For many women, the hardest struggle was the constant uncertainty surrounding the fate of loved ones serving on distant fronts. Letters from husbands, sons, or brothers often arrived months late, and sometimes not at all. The gaps between messages widened as the war intensified, leaving women to wonder if silence meant injury, capture, or death. They scanned every envelope carefully, sometimes trembling before opening it, terrified it might contain official mourning notifications or terse announcements of loss. Even when the letters held reassuring words, they rarely eased the deeper anxiety that accompanied the long stretches of not knowing. This emotional pressure was compounded by the physical exhaustion caused by sleepless nights spent underground. The shelters, though protective in purpose, were often cramped, humid, and filled with the sharp odor of sweat, dust, and fear. Mothers clutched their children tightly while listening to the distant rumble of approaching bombers. Each explosion above them sending vibrations through the walls and floors. Every tremor made their hearts race, and every loud thud outside intensified their belief that destruction might be waiting for them once daylight broke. Trauma also took subtler forms. Many women developed a habit of scanning the sky instinctively, even during calm hours, searching for danger that might appear without warning. Loud sounds, trams screeching, doors slamming, crates falling, triggered moments of panic. Children would cry out in fear, and mothers had to soothe them, even while coping with their own trembling nerves. Life became a continuous balancing act between maintaining composure and dealing with internal fractures created by repeated brushes with death. Loss became an uninvited yet familiar presence in their lives. Entire blocks could be reduced to rubble overnight, taking with them neighbors, friends, and extended families. Women often emerged from shelters at dawn to find that homes they had visited just the day before were now heaps of charred beams and shattered stone. They walked through devastation with numbed expressions, calling out the names of people who might never answer again. These searches sometimes ended in tears, other times in hollow acceptance, but always reinforced the painful reality that the war could claim lives without warning. Many women also carried guilt. Guilt for surviving when others had not. Guilt for not being able to protect their children from the horrors unfolding around them. Guilt over belongings lost or treasured mementos burned in the fires. Even when they knew rationally that there was nothing they could have done, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on their hearts. They pushed themselves to remain strong, but inside, they battled thoughts that left deep emotional scars. The strain extended to mothers raising children without their fathers. They bore the responsibility of maintaining discipline, providing comfort, ensuring nutrition, and guiding emotional development at a time when their own emotional resources were stretched thin. Some children became withdrawn, clinging to their mothers with fearful eyes, while others rebelled against the tension, acting out in ways that further complicated the already fragile household environment. Mothers did their best to maintain stability, but behind their firm voices and comforting embraces lay fears they could not voice aloud. Widows faced an even greater burden. News of a husband's death arrived with cold finality, often delivered by uniformed officials who stayed only long enough to hand over a document before leaving the grieving woman to collapse into despair. Widows had to navigate sorrow while still ensuring survival for themselves and their families. They often returned to work within days of receiving the devastating news because war did not allow them the luxury of mourning. Their grief became silent, tucked away between shifts, errands, and responsibilities. Community connections offered some emotional support. Women shared their fears, exchanged whispered stories of loss, and comforted one another after particularly devastating raids. They leaned on each other not merely for assistance, but for understanding, something that only those experiencing the same terror could provide. These moments of companionship brought small but significant relief, reminding them that they were not alone in facing the relentless psychological assault of wartime Berlin. As the bombings intensified, mental fatigue set in. Thoughts became heavy, sleep grew shallow, and tears were shed in silence. Many women described feeling disconnected from their surroundings, as though their lives were happening at a distance. The destruction around them, though horrifying, became strangely familiar, and this normalization of chaos reflected a deeper psychological shift. They had adapted, but the adaptation came at the cost of emotional numbness. Still, even under crushing mental strain, they continued fulfilling roles essential to survival. They cooked meals from whatever ingredients remained, soothed frightened children, tended to the sick, and rebuilt shattered rooms after each raid. Their endurance became a testament to their strength, though it was a strength born from necessity rather than choice. They held on to hope in small ways, saving letters, keeping photographs close, praying for the safety of their loved ones, and believing that one day the night skies would be free of bombers.